And I want to begin by thanking the International Mediation Campus for the opportunity to make this presentation. And what I'll be doing is sharing some experiences and reflections on work that I've been part of in Scotland with an organisation, the Centre for Good Relations. The organisation is a very small mediation organisation. We specialise in what we call civic mediation. And that has involved in the last few years work around a range of different protest events and working with the people that get involved in those. The images on the screen at the moment include an image of a Black Lives Matter protest against racism, an orange parade, an orange order walk, and that is an expression of identity by a particular section of the community in Scotland, which sometimes causes controversy. It's linked to religious, sometimes what are called sectarian divisions, and we've been doing work around that. And the other image on there is of some of the stuff that we do in community centres, talking with the people that might be part of those things. Some of those images link to the origin of our organisation. The Orange Order in Scotland is linked to the Orange Order in Ireland, and the approach that we use at the Centre for Good Relations was developed in Northern Ireland as part of the peace process there. And what we've done in England and in Scotland is apply it to the local circumstances that we find ourselves in. I'm an Englishman who's moved to Scotland. I first got involved in this work when we were doing work against racism in towns in Northern England where the far right was being successful politically. And so that's part of the background. I'm very conscious, given the diversity of places and situations that people have come from for this seminar, that what I'll be talking about is very much my experience in the specific locale, and that some of the dynamics and factors to do with protests and demonstrations, activity on the streets, will feel very different in different countries, depending on all kinds of factors, including relationships between the state and civil society, the character of policing, the intensity of the issues that you're working on. But hopefully some of this will be helpful, at least in stimulating discussion and consideration. One of the other issues that we've begun increasingly working on in Scotland, it doesn't very much involve protests and demonstrations, but is work around changes in the way that things are done in the countryside. There's many areas of Scotland which are very rural and look like they're picture postcards, beautiful countryside, striking landscapes, but there can be all kinds of conflicts and disputes over things like land management. And one of the things that we've been working on recently are the reactions that there are from people to proposals for change as a result of the government responding to climate change. And that leads to changes for people in their way of living and in their way of earning a living. And these images are of some work that we've been doing around deer management in Scotland. Now, all of these things came together for the Centre for Good Relations a couple of years ago, when the big international conference on climate change, the United Nations conference, COP26, was coming to our country. And we said, we work around marches and demonstrations and protests. We are increasingly working on environmental issues. The big United Nations Environmental Conference, COP26, is coming to Glasgow. There'll be protests and demonstrations there. We should do something about it. And so for the purposes of the COP26 Environmental Conference, we organised, together with partner organisations, an initiative called Keeping Our Cool. And that involved a lot of work around protests and demonstrations that we reflected on and that we've written up, so that that's the basis of many of the comments I'll be making. Keeping Our Cool, as I say, we worked with Scottish Mediation, the umbrella organisation for mediators in Scotland, and a faith-based organisation, Place for Hope. to draw together nearly 50 volunteers. Our own organisation's only 7 or 8 people, but we drew in lots of other people who, as a team, worked every day across 2 weeks in partnership when the COP26 conference was on. We had funding for this from the Scottish Government, and some of the other work that we're doing around marches and parades is funded by the Scottish Government. I'll talk more about that in a little while and the issues that that raises. But our aim was really to provide a calming presence during the COP26, to work around marches and parades on the city's squares and the streets of the city, to directly assist people around a range of issues that we expected might come up, and to be ready to make direct and positive interventions where things were happening and there was issues around escalation. And through that activity, we think that we made a contribution, modest but real, to the likelihood that the COP26 would proceed in a peaceful manner. But we also, as mediators, learned a great deal about how the principles of mediation can be applied at protests and demonstrations, as well as working in partnership with lots of other people to build our networks. I've said a little bit about the organisation. I want to just spell out a bit more about what we mean by civic mediation. What we aim to do is apply the principles of mediation to situations where groups of people, sometimes organised groups, sometimes more informal, are drawn together into dialogue and exchange and consideration of their shared space. And many people here will be familiar with the general approach of mediation. I guess what we're doing is trying to apply that to societal divisions, to disputed issues and contested issues that are apparent in terms of political and social divisions and dynamics. Our key approach is to strengthen relationships between strategically placed individuals. We work at the grassroots level, and we aim to work at the highest levels of policy making as well. Obviously, the unevenness happens in terms of who gets engaged and who gets involved, but that's certainly what we're always working for. In the background in our approach is a view that conflict is inevitable. It is inevitable and in many ways proper that there are going to be differences of opinion, there are going to be disputes, people are going to see things a different way. The issue is, can contention be handled well? Can we handle the differences of opinion that result from different people's positions in a way that is productive and contributes to decision making that's well informed, or do the differences lead to new problems? Do they involve destructive violence? Do they involve hurt and waste? And obviously we're looking to support people who are looking at how they can address serious divisions and serious differences of opinion in ways which are productive. So that's some general stuff on the background. In terms of the particular initiative we did, Keeping Our Cool, there was a real scramble of work from the moment that we decided that we were going to do this. We recruited our team of workers on it, and the volunteers, most people who took part, did so on a voluntary basis. We secured a base in the centre of Glasgow from which to do our work. We needed to find accommodation for people that were coming in from other parts of Scotland into Glasgow, the country's biggest city, but also from other parts of the United Kingdom and from Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland as well. And as I say, we had some budget support from the Scottish Government, who were clear that it would be helpful to have a mediation service on the streets and the squares of the city. In our discussions with the Scottish Government, we made clear, as we always do with funders, we'll take your money to support this project and to pay for the publicity and to pay for the equipment and to pay for the expenses, but we are not here as mediators to promote your views or your agenda. Our approach is to work with everybody. And if some of the people that we work with find themselves in dispute with the government over some issues, we would see you as a party to the mediation. We wouldn't be consultants working on your behalf. We often find that funders are very happy to agree with that when we put it in such a reasonable way, until and unless that actually happens. And we're saying to them, you're a party in this dispute. We need to involve you in an equal way with the other people that are protesting against you. As part of the big preparation for the Keeping Our Cool, we did quite a lot of training and skill sharing. As I say, we were bringing 50 people together to work as a pop-up mediation service around protests, some of which would be large, some of which might be quite spiky. And so we were keen to make sure that we worked through lots of practicalities. We thought about the activities that people would be doing, as well as people that would be actually out on the streets. We had a team of people that were providing remote support. They were available on the end of a phone. They were monitoring social media. We were checking in with them. They were able to advise us about how things looked from a distance, and that could help inform our operational decisions in running Keeping Our Cool. We had a big input on security, health and safety from a colleague who worked for many years from Médecins Sans Frontières, with responsibility for security and safety issues for the MSF teams that she managed. We had an input from a colleague from Northern Ireland on the skills and the approaches involved in holding difficult conversations. An academic, a well-known psychologist, Andrea, in Scotland, gave us a session on crowd dynamics, what might be happening if there's large groups of people operating as crowds. And we had quite a lot of talk about our specific role. We ran sessions about the differences between being an activist and being a mediator. Quite a few of the people who volunteered to take part in Keeping Our Cool did so saying that they wanted to work at the COP26 event because they themselves felt strongly about environmental issues. They felt that things need to be done urgently to address the environmental agenda, the climate change situation that we are in. And of course, that's really understandable, but it gave us a little bit of an anxiety about whether, with that strong motivation about the issue being in the front of people's minds, they would be able to play the mediation role if they were in, for example, a situation where the police or council officials, local municipal officials, were unhappy about something that environmental protesters were doing. Would they be truly mediative in their approach if they had a particular agenda? And so we ran these sessions which were about considering, well, what's the difference between being an activist and being a mediator? You might be motivated by particular values, but how do you express and use those values in those different roles? And we ran scenario role plays. How might an activist challenge a mediator? Come on, you should be joining us. You should be flying our flag. You should be on this protest pushing against the oil extraction industry or whatever, if you believe in. And what might the mediator invite activists to do if a dispute or a protest was building up and was becoming more contentious? Would it be appropriate? How would it be appropriate for mediators to invite activists to consider the pros and cons, the benefits and the drawbacks of various things that they might do? Once we'd done our training, the pattern of daily activities was to assemble at our base in the city centre. We had briefings on what had happened the day before, what we understood might be happening that day. And if you can imagine it, across a big part of the city, as well as the formal conference that was taking place behind closed doors in a range of venues, there were quite often 7, 8, 9 different protests taking place, sometimes marches, sometimes rallies, and sometimes those were ones where there was contention and issues coming up. Once we'd understood what people felt about the work we'd done the previous few days and what we were expecting would happen in the city this day, we deployed the team members to particular locations. You can see a copy of one of our routers up there. We checked in with them. Some of us were team leaders, and we checked in to see how things were going. We had inputs from remote support, and most of all thought about people's well-being as well as their safety. There was a need sometimes to insist on people that they take breaks. There was so much going on in the city, and it was so interesting that some people forgot to go to the toilet or eat a sandwich. So that was important. We closed the activities late afternoon, early evening, sometimes worked into the evening with a debrief. And I've already said there was a range of things going on. Sometimes things were organised, they'd been publicised, they were posters up, we knew they were happening where and when, and those might be static rallies or they might be marches. There were other activities that hadn't been publicly announced. The picture on the screen at the moment is one of those. This is a protest outside a bank in the centre of Glasgow, and the environmental protesters, including Extinction Rebellion people, identified that bank as responsible for environmentally destructive oil industry investments. And so sometimes we heard that something was happening, we went there to see what was going on. Some of those activities that weren't publicised had been well planned, but they just hadn't published, the organisers hadn't publicised them, so that there was an element of surprise for the authorities in terms of what happened. Other things developed kind of spontaneously. A group of people found that they were together in the same place with the same concerns and the same ambitions, and if you like, there and then decided to organise an activity. And the next few slides are little excerpts of things, particular situations that we were in at different times. And these are written up in a report. I'll send you later on the link to be able to download this report from our website. These are just to give you some examples of specific things that we were doing. I know there's colleagues here on the call from Germany. There was a group of environmental activists who'd walked all the way from Germany, I think Hamburg, to Glasgow. So they'd walked along the roads of Germany and France and come over on the ferry and pushed this large metal ball, an 8-foot diameter ball that you can see on the image there, all the way to Glasgow. And they brought with them statements, promises to the earth, which children and families had made in the events that they'd organised in the run-up to COP26. And then when they got to Glasgow, the police said, oh, you can't carry on walking along the road now. So they walked all the way with this metal ball, but because they'd not applied in advance for permission to be able to roll the ball through the streets, the police initially judged that this was a hazard and it hadn't been planned. You mustn't do it. And so there was a great frustration, understandably, on the part of the environmental activists. This was an example of where we did a little bit of problem solving and spoke to police officers that we'd made contacts with to explain the agenda of the environmentalist activists. Went back to the environmentalist activists at a certain point, brokered a meeting and an agreement about what would be done, which both sides felt satisfying. So we were pleased with that as a small example, and one amongst many of the kind of problem solving things that we did. The next page, and again, I'll talk it through, I'm not asking people to read it now, was where a group of Extinction Rebellion people did one of these things that I've called a spontaneous activity. They recognised there was 50 or 60 of them together. They recognised that there were relatively few police officers around monitoring what they were doing, and made an agreement between themselves that without notifying the police, they would set off walking through the city. And that unsettled the police. The police kind of then put a cordon around the Extinction Rebellion people, but then they also radioed ahead to put a larger force of police near one of the main roads going through the city. And what happened was that there was a kind of standoff between the marchers and the police, which neither of them had planned for and expected. And there was at one point, so at the beginning, there was only two of us there as mediators. We were of the view that this was a risky situation for everybody involved, because a misunderstanding could lead to arrests being made of the protesters, which they hadn't wanted to happen. And there was a risk for the police of them overreacting because they were not briefed and in control of the situation. Now, as mediators, it's not our job to come forward and say, we can see a problem, we propose a solution. So what we were doing by this point was talking to some of the police officers, talking to some of the protesters, and saying, what's going on from your point of view? How do you see the situation? And is there anything that you would want us to tell the other side about how you see it? This was at a point with a group of people where the protesters were not wanting to speak to the police, and the police were feeling rebuffed when they directly attempted to speak to the protesters. But both sides, if you want to put it that way, were talking to us with some hesitation, I've got to say, from the protesters. This was at an early stage across the 2 weeks. But again, our view is that by relaying messages between the different groups of people in that situation, misunderstandings were avoided. And I think I want to underline it, that what we were wanting to do was contribute to people making informed decisions. If protesters decide we are going to push this, we are going to be breaking the rules that the police are setting for us, we're even going to be physically confrontational with the police, that is their decision. It's not our job as mediators to get in the way of that. If the police decide this has gone far enough, we're going to take this action, then that's their decision. We're not about getting in the way of that. But if people aren't sure what the other people are going to do, and people are in a risky situation of something happening which they didn't intend and which isn't the way that they wanted the day to go, and that can be avoided by mutual agreement, which mediators can help broker, we see that as a positive contribution that's not about blocking or cutting across anybody's existing plans, but is an extra additional positive element to the situation. And the last image, and I won't talk this through in detail, was where actually in response to a contingent of demonstrators who were members of a communist organisation who had been quite confrontational in terms of their style and their approach with the police. The police put a blockade around this group of protesters and blocked them from taking part in the bigger demonstration, which they wanted to be part of. And again, we got involved in talking to the police and suggesting ways in which the situation could be de-escalated. Across the couple of weeks, we, as I say, collected information on what we've been doing. I've put a link on there, which is where you can get to a report, which is freely downloadable, and I'll put that into the chat later on. One of the conversations that we were having was to what degree we wanted our activity to be publicised. We did have little publicity leaflets that we put out to the protesters who were coming into the city, many of them for the first time, so we didn't have pre-existing relationships with them. We did want to point out the approach that we were making, but we didn't want us to be central to it. Nevertheless, at least one of our colleagues, this one's a picture of my colleague Abdul Rahim, ended up being interviewed on international television about what it is that mediators were trying to help with at at COP26. I just want to take a few more minutes, Andrea, to just talk a little bit more slowly about some of the lessons that we learned as mediators operating at protests and demonstrations during the COP26 days, and we've made further use of these in the demonstrations and parades and protests that we've worked around since then in Scotland, such as the Orange Walks that I showed the photograph of earlier. And one thing that we're clear about is the importance of what we're calling the optics, the way that things look to everybody in terms of our activity as mediators. As you can see, we've chosen, unusually for mediators, I think, at the COP26 events, because they were so big, to have a visible presence. We had these tabards, keeping our cool tabards, and blue beanie hats that made us look like we were part of the same team. And so what would happen is we would arrive at a place where there was an event or a protest going on, and we'd be meeting delegates who were attending the COP26 thing, and we'd be talking to them about what they're doing, how they feel about how things are going, explaining a little bit about our role, and saying that we would be available if any situation developed that might be helped with a mediation input. But we really got into a rhythm of behaving in particular ways when we arrived at a place. If there was two of us, one of us would go and speak to the protesters, one of us would go and speak to the police, maybe another person would go and speak to somebody working in the building which the protest was taking place outside. And we would do that at more or less the same time. And then we would come together as a group of 2 or 3 people to talk together in view of all the different parties. And our intention there was to illustrate and evidence that we were looking to talk to all the different people that were in the situation, and that we were both working as a team and we were working with all the different groups of people. We were happy to explain our role to police. We were explaining our role to protesters. We had made some contacts in advance of the COP26 days, certainly at senior level with the police, but many of the police officers in Glasgow had been brought in from other parts of the country, and so we needed to reinforce the briefings to them. Many of the protesters, as I say, we hadn't met before, but we'd met some of the bigger organisers of the protests at COP26. So we had to explain our role recurrently. And our team members had different levels of confidence. So we sometimes had to, some of us take a lead, other people were watching how other people were describing it. The people we talked to had different levels of confidence in us. Some people understood what the mediation role was. Some people were comfortable with it. Some people, I'm going to say, saw it as possibly getting in their way. Police officers said, "Why, yeah, we're doing our job. It's our job to keep the streets safe. We don't need any other help." We got a lot of challenging and understandably challenging questions from some of the protesters. You say you're here to help. You say that you're impartial. You say that you're mediators, but who's paying you? Oh, you're getting paid by the government. So in that case, you must be here to promote the government agenda. No, we say we're paid by the government. We'll take their money. If you want to give us money, we'll take some expenses from you as well. But actually, we are clear about our role being one that works with everybody. We do want to be independent as mediators. That was a question an answer that satisfied some of us and satisfied many of the people that we talked to, but it didn't satisfy all of us, and it didn't satisfy everybody we spoke to, because some people were saying, even so, even though we respect your role as a mediator, simply the fact that you're here is an attempt to soften protests and soften voices which actually need to be heard loud and clearly and sharply. And therefore, even offering a mediative role is an intervention with a certain liberal outlook, was the challenge to us. And this is something that we've done a great deal of thinking about, a little bit beforehand, but even so since. And I think it's sharpened up our understanding about the way in which we need as mediators to be clear about our role and our relationships with the different people that are involved in protest situations. And it goes back to those issues that we did the preliminary training on in terms of the differences between being an activist and being a mediator. The photograph here is of one of the people that we recognised as a key organiser with Extinction Rebellion, talking with a couple of our colleagues about why are you here, are you really helping? And perhaps it's worth pointing out, of course, this was an event that took place during the time that COVID was something that everybody was attending to as an issue, the masks result from that. I should also say that the photographs that we are sharing with permission, because as the events carried on, we were able to build relationships with people, including this individual who was aware of what we were about and happy for us to publicise the work that we'd done. Okay, those points are things I think I've already mentioned quite a bit, but as I say, for us as mediators who already worked on protests and demonstrations, getting involved in this big COP26 event, working on the streets and the squares of Glasgow every day for a 2-week period, sometimes for quite long days, and positioning ourselves in relation to the protests and demonstrations that were going on, not to cut across anybody's agenda, not to say to anybody in terms of their plans and intentions and the reasons that they were there, that they shouldn't be doing what they were doing, but to be available as an independent role as a mediator to help address communication issues, misunderstandings, problems that might be developing, which both sides or 3 sides would want to resolve through discussion, was what we were about. And there's just a couple of images to finish. I want to end by thanking you very much for your time and patience, giving me the opportunity to talk about those experiences of working on those issues.